All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA IAJO speaker session entitled Improving Capabilities for Operations in the Information Environment, Information Forces, and Intelligence Support. I'd also like to thank today's speakers, Dr. Christopher Paul and Dr. Michael Schwille, for taking the time to present today. So just a few quick housekeeping items before we go ahead and begin. So we'll be having a virtual Q&A session at the conclusion of the session. So during the briefs or during the Q&A, please feel free to submit your questions through the live event Q&A chat. It's a chat icon and it has two overlapping speech bubbles and one is a question mark. Also be sure to type in your name and affiliation before you submit your question, or if you'd prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, go ahead and submit your questions anonymously. You can also vote on which questions you'd like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to that question. All right, so now I'm going to briefly introduce today's speakers before I turn the floor over to them. Dr. Christopher Paul is a senior social scientist at the RAND Corporation and a professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. Dr. Paul has developed methodological competencies in comparative historical and case study approaches, evaluation research, and various forms of quantitative analysis and survey research. We also have Mr. Michael Schwille, who's a senior policy analyst at RAND. He has experience with the Joint Army and Marine Corps concept development, operations in the information environment, countering A2AD strategies, strategic workforce analysis, and force development. Also, while at RAND, he's led several NSRD and Arroyo projects related to the information operations, intelligence integration, the creation of the Army's information concept, and tactically focused information operations. So Dr. Paul and Mr. Schwille, I will turn the floor over to you now.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Appreciate the warm introduction. Let's see if we can figure out how to share the right slide there. Is that it?
Yes, give me 1 second.
Sure.
All right, the slides are live.
All right. So, 1 second here. Always something with technology, right? There we go. All right. So, hi. As Nicole mentioned, my name's Mike Schwille. I'll be doing kind of the first piece of this brief, and then turning it over to Chris before we get to questions and answers here in about 30 minutes. So today we're going to be talking about improving capabilities for operations in the information environment. So that looking both at information forces and intelligence support. So the requirement for information forces really has been building for quite some time. But let's start a little bit broader than that before we talk about information forces themselves. Starting back in 2003 with the Information Operations Roadmap, you see a number of different publications there that are pretty seminal in this space. And there's been a lot of push and a lot of interest from Congress for the Department of Defense to get better at conducting operations in the information environment. And there has been interest. The interest level within the Department of Defense in this particular space has kind of waxed and waned over the years, and now we're really kind of at a crest. And there's a lot of interest, a lot of resource, a lot of moving around concept and capability kind of development that's going on. And so while all of these documents here don't specifically call for the creation of information forces, they do touch on the topic. And so let me call out and talk about just a few here really quick. So the strategy for operations in the information environment, published in 2016, really is a cornerstone document that is geared to aligning the Department of Defense actions to integrate operations in the information environment. And this was really in response to a National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 14. Additionally, I want to highlight the joint concept for operations in the information environment, which was published in 2018. And in there, it had four kind of core requirements, those being to characterize and assess the informational, physical, and human aspects of the security environment, to provide options to integrate physical and informational power, then to provide methods to execute those operations, and then really to institutionalize the integration of physical and informational power. The last one that I'd highlight here is the Government Accountability Office, the GAO report titled Information Operations. DoD should improve leadership and integration efforts, and that was published in 2019. And in that particular GAO report, there were a number of findings that the Department of Defense rejected. Include one being the review of a posture review for the DoD strategy for operations in the information environment. So interestingly, that was rejected by the Department of Defense. Well, now that's in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 20. And so this is all to say that there's a lot of interest in this space. And there's a lot of activity, a lot of things that are going on. And so what we're going to talk about today is this brief in particular is really bringing together two independent efforts. The first is a RAND report titled Improving Intelligence Support for Operations in the Information Environment, and I'll primarily cover that topic. And then there's a Joint Force Quarterly article that's been published recently titled The Evolution of Special Operations as a Model for Information Forces. And so the second one focuses on SOF as a model, and then the first report, which we're going to talk about here, really kind of dives into the seam between intelligence support for operations in the information environment, and between the IO, the intelligence operations community, and in the intelligence community. And so to tee this up and to put a bit of a finer point on it, there are a lot of stovepipes within the information community here, and just as recently as last week, members of Congress were highlighting some of the lackluster response from the Department of Defense, talking about their ability to integrate and to conduct operations in the information environment. And I bring this up, and I usually don't quote representatives, but the Representative Jim Langevin, the chairman for the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Cyber, Innovative Technologies, and Information Systems, said in his opening remarks before that subcommittee last Friday, so less than a week ago, he said, and I quote, "Too often it appears that the department's information-related capabilities are stovepipe centers of excellence with varied management and leadership structures, which makes critical coordination more difficult. Further, the Pentagon has made limited progress implementing its 2016 operations in the information environment strategy." And then he went on from there. But to highlight the congressman's points there, we have this chart here on the left-hand side, starting obviously with the Secretary of Defense. And what this does, this was taken from that GAO report, and it talks about some of the stovepipes for responsibilities within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So starting at the undersecretary level, you see a number of different capability areas there. So for the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment is responsible for electronic warfare. The Undersecretary for Policy is responsible for cyber operations, information operations, and military information support operations. While you have the Intelligence and Undersecretary responsible for military deception and operational security. But a lot of these responsibilities have been delegated to either an Assistant Secretary of Defense, for cyber operations being the Assistant Secretary for Homeland Defense and Global Security, and then for military information support operations, that being designated the ASD for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. And then even further delegation for information operations, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism has been designated as the IO representative. And so this is to show that there are a lot of different individuals, a lot of different organizations and entities at the OSD level are responsible for the development of these capabilities, for the policy, for the resourcing. Then on the right-hand side here, we have just one service, using the Army as an example, talking about the functional responsibilities. And so on the left-hand side of underneath the designated area, you see a number of capability areas: civil affairs, cyber operations, electronic warfare, and then the others. And then you see who the force modernization proponent within the Army is, and you can quickly see that we have Special Operations Center of Excellence, we have the Cyber Center of Excellence, the Intel Center of Excellence, the Combined Arms Center, right? And this is all just goes to show that there are a lot of different entities that are responsible for capability development here. And so now let's move and turn to the seam, the gap there between the intelligence community and the information operations community. And we'll highlight this through the first body of work. And so this one was a study that was conducted on behalf of the European Command, the J39. And this study was asked to really look at and to identify the challenges, requirements, and opportunities to help improve intelligence support for operations in the information environment, specifically really looking at the geographic combatant commands. And it was designed to help them to organize better, to think about investments, and just to really to help the information the intelligence community provide better support to the information operations community. So in short, we were really asked to help think through how the IO community and the intelligence community can work better together. And so to do this, we had three guiding questions. The first was, what data, information, analysis, and understanding is required for the IO and the information related capability communities to help with planning, integration, and execution. The second question was, who could collect the needed information and conduct the required analyses, and what were the barriers or the challenges to this? And then third, who should collect, process, and analyze the needed information, and what changes across the .mil PFP spectrum were needed to enable this arrangement? And so this study was conducted primarily in 2018 and early 2019, and then it ended up sitting in security review for almost a year. However, the main report itself, the one there on the right-hand side, and then the research brief, which I would encourage everybody to download and take a look at, which is only about 4 or 5 pages there, they were both published in December of last year. And so, while this research was conducted a few years ago, a lot of it is still timely, and a lot of the issues, the challenges and issues that we highlight, as well as the solutions, are still relevant today. Some of the feedback that I've gotten recently, so from the Combined Forces Command in Korea and U.S. Forces Korea, they used this report for the academics portion of an exercise that they conducted recently. In talking with some folks at the Joint Enabling Capabilities Command, they found some relevance and some interest in some of the solution sets that we provide. And then colleagues in various embassies, specifically out in the Indo-PACOM AOR, are looking into using the report for some of their engagement with our partners and our allies. So what's kind of the bottom line up front, and what is the report really kind of all about? And so first, it highlights a number of challenges that confront both the information operations and the intelligence communities. And we identify that a lot of these challenges are long-standing, they're embedded deeply in these two communities, and they're pervasive throughout both of these cultures, because the cultures are different. And the responsibility for conducting intelligence support for operations in the information environment, it really boils down to the main issue is all about responsibility. So information is really the lifeblood for both of these communities. And what really separates them is how that information is compiled, sorted, analyzed, and used. And so we found that some commands have a better handle on intelligence support to operations in the information environment than other commands. However, in all of these commands, there is definitely friction between the responsibilities for doing the collection, the analysis, and the processing. We identified 6 types of challenges that ended up hindering support for this topic. There were 40 individual issues that we bucketed into these 6 challenge categories. And then there were about 70 solutions that we identified, and we bucketed those into 4 solution categories. And then lastly, the responsibility here for fixing the challenges that we outline in the report really fall equally on both the intelligence and information professionals. there's a lot that can be done, really kind of where the rubber meets the road, improving processes, building collaboration, coordination. However, there are some institutional challenges that are going to require outside entities to engage with and to fix. And so here on the next couple of slides, we go through the I'll go through the challenges and then the issues before turning it over to Chris for his discussion on using SOF as a model. So what are the challenges to improving intelligence support? So I'll give you just a moment here to take a look at our 6 categories. And so these are the high level kind of rolled up summary of these challenges. If you're interested in seeing what all of the individual challenges are, again, I would encourage you to take a look at the report where we have them all aligned out. But the first one is coordination and collaboration. And this one talks a lot about how these communities, both the IO and the intelligence communities, interact with each other. And so many of the challenges integrating these two communities, I mean, it really stems from a lack of mutual understanding and underdeveloped or non-existent relationships. And so this includes a number of common processes. And so even when doctrine is established, a lot of these processes just aren't really ingrained in the command and in these two communities. However, there are pockets of effectiveness, but unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be much of an institutional foundation to support them. And really, it boils down to kind of the action officer level in individual personalities to make a lot of these processes work. The next category is we titled division of labor. And here, this really focuses on the tension of who should be responsible for what kind of tasks. And so key challenges in this category really span the range of who should be responsible for the collection of the information, the fusion of information, and different expectations of analytic rigor. Additionally, they talked about staffing decisions and how ad hoc manning is kind of more the order of the day for folks in the information operations community versus longer term standing requirements being staffed for the intelligence community on a more systematic basis. The next category talks about missing expertise. And this category talks about the gaps in skills and knowledge necessary to complete tasks related to intelligence support for operations in the information environment. And this really highlights a lack of expertise in both communities, often resulting from a lack of training and education. But this isn't to say that there are no courses that are available, because certainly we know that there are some. Rather, it's falls to there's limited instruction, and there are limited courses in the number of personnel that are being sent to these courses. One area that I would highlight here that has changed, I think, rather significantly since this analysis was conducted back in 2018 is in the field of open source intelligence. We know there's a lot that's been done recently in this field, and so that's one thing that we do highlight in the report that has undergone some changes. Prioritization is the next category, and here we talk about issues that stem from failures to sufficiently prioritize operations in the information environment within a command or within another organization. And oftentimes these challenges could have been met, but they aren't, because when they are kind of racked and stacked with other priorities, they often don't meet the threshold necessary for action. One particular issue here is the request for information process, the RFI process, where information operations professionals will put in an RFI and then it just isn't addressed. The next category talks about gaps in concepts or doctrine, and here challenges in this category really reflect the lack of doctrine in particular being up to date. We realize that there's a lot going on in this space. Look at the second slide there. A lot of documents that are coming out. There's a lot of movement in this space. However, when doctrine is emerging, it's when it's in a state of flux, the practice will kind of inevitably lag. And so the issues in this category really referenced the use of IO products, the information environment, common operation picture, and the management process that surrounds it, the integration of non-lethal targeting, and considerations of how operations in the information environment is utilized and is considered in the planning process. Last category we had here talks about intelligence oversight or intelligence authorities. And this really pertains to the rules and oversight mechanisms that apply to the intelligence enterprise. However, that isn't to say that it doesn't affect information operations personnel as well, because it certainly does. But what we're really talking about is the legal and policy restrictions placed on the intelligence community and how those limit an organization's ability to collect information on U.S. persons. And so we realize that monitoring, as one example, monitoring kind of versus engaging in this social media space. And there's a lot that has been written, and there's I know new policies, new DOTIs that have come out since this research was conducted that have added some clarity to this space. But this is still relatively new and unprecedented territory, and some of the items in that category really that's what they addressed. And so overall, there was 40 distinct issues, and each issues could have been coded into multiple categories. So that isn't to say that one issue could be put into the prioritization, the missing expertise, and the division of labor. But when we really boiled it down, there was 40 separate issues. And so how did we solve those issues? Well, we had 4 approaches to improving Intel support here. And we broke those down into these 4 categories, the top of which have the number of unique solutions for each of these categories. So let's briefly kind of talk about those. So the first one is improving processes. In this solution, the category addressed challenges that expose shortcomings or deficiencies in existing processes. And so this addresses both processes unique to the intelligence and the information operations communities. And so there were solutions assigned, more solutions assigned to this category than to any of the other ones. So processes here really talked about the need to improve the socialization between these two communities. And so we know that each community has its own established culture, and it's likely going to be necessary to push or to nudge or to cajole these two communities towards each other to help with the process improvement. The couple processes in particular of note that were mentioned a number of times were the targeting process, as well as the tasking or the request for information process. The next category is prioritizing support. There were 16 unique solutions in this category, and often effective support is possible, but it wasn't fully provided or provided at all because of competing commanders' priorities or institutional priorities. And so, as an example, an IO professional can ask a question to have somebody in the intelligence community provide some analysis to help them out. But often that wasn't done because of, again, limited manpower and competing demands and priorities on that analyst. The next category is training and education, and in this category we had 13 unique solutions, and this really deals with the institutionalization of intelligence support to operations in the information environment. And so both the IO and intelligence personnel need additional training and educational opportunities to increase their knowledge, because there generally is a lack of understanding between the roles and responsibilities between these two communities. And so there needs to be more opportunities to bring these communities together. Think for a minute about the number of joint or service exercises that are out there that really have a specific focus on to conduct training for operations in the information environment. Also think about the number of the courses that are out there. And while I know that the number has been increasing over the years, there still isn't a lot. and they're not provided kind of at all levels, from junior analysts to the senior most personnel. Another issue deals with the lexicon and how often these two communities end up talking past each other instead of communicating directly to each other because of the difference in lexicon. So as kind of a specific example of what could be done in this space, look at sending IO personnel to a training, to a targeting course, or have intelligence community analysts train on operations in the information environment. The last category talks about the allocation of personnel, and this focuses primarily on near-term personnel shortages rather than on creating a large body of intelligence analysts. However, I mean, that is something that should be looked at as well. So there really is an overall lack of personnel to support operations in the information environment and provide that analytic support. There needs to be more personnel in this space. One senior defense intelligence analyst talked about the intelligence community has been in this space before, and he termed it, using air quotes here, boutique intelligence organizations, where they have focused on providing dedicated support to the information environment, thinking cultural factors and human factors analysis, thinking about looking into the decision making of local leaders. And while those organizations have lasted for a while, I believe that the term the IC, the intelligence community antibodies, don't generally like those types of organizations, and so they are slowly kind of under-resourced and undermanned, and they disappear over time. But solutions in this particular space look at having a J39 or a J2, having liaisons between those two shops, or building a cross-functional team, or some other kind of mechanism to help divide responsibilities and ensure coordination. So this chart here is really looking at, so who should be responsible for fixing all of these issues that we just talked about, right? So we just laid out some of the challenges, and then we paired those with solutions. And this is really talking about who should be responsible for implementing those solutions. And so we have three different categories of community, right? We have the operations in the information environment, or the information operations community, generally sitting in the J39, but also including the information related capability personnel. And then we have the intelligence community, generally sitting in the J2s. These are the analysts there. And then we also identified a number of other organizations or entities. So sometimes that can be a commander, that can be the J3, but that can also be a policy or an institution that may be responsible for helping out with some of these, implement these solutions. So as you can see, just taking a look at this chart, there's a fairly even split between a lot of these groups. You can see that the IO, or the operations in the information environment community, has a lot of we place a lot of responsibility for improving processes, while they're fairly evenly balanced across prioritized support and then training and education. And then when you look at who can responsibility for allocating personnel, that often comes down to the commander or from outside organizations. So I'll just summarize here everything that I basically said on the bottom line up front slide. So the IO professionals really need to be the champions of this type of analysis, and they need to be the ones reaching out to the intelligence community and helping to train them up, to working with them, to build that bridge. If the IO community are the ones that need the support, they need to be the ones that are reaching out. Yet at the same time, the intelligence community needs to be receptive and to help the IO community craft those refined requests for information, and so that the IO personnel are asking smart questions, so that the intelligence community can then help them by providing some of that analysis. There are a number of challenges here that we talked about. We grouped those into 6 categories. Obviously, some of those have easier fixes than others. Thinking about improving processes or how to divide who's working on what issue are easier than the long-term allocation of personnel issues. This is also a two-sided problem, right? There's a lot that needs to be done, both from the intelligence side of the house as well as the IO side. And then finally, we identified four groups of categories of solution. that can be used to help integrate intel support to operations in the information environment. And so I will stop talking here, and I will turn it over to Chris, who will now talk about using SOF as a model for developing information forces.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, everyone. So here we're in the same space. After working with Mike on intelligence support to operations in the information environment, we took a step back to think about the broader and higher level problem. And this comes back to Mike's first slide, where he showed the cylinders of excellence in which we find the different information-related capabilities, responsibility for and advocacy for those, training for those different communities, and thinking about these atomized, sometimes isolated information professionals, and thinking, hey, how can we? Is there a good learning example? And if you know some history, if you think back to the history of special operations forces, we think there is some useful learning to be done looking at how we got from where SOF used to be to how we got to where SOF are now, which inarguably is a robust, healthy community within the Department of Defense. Whereas information forces such as they are perhaps don't yet deserve that appellation. So let's think a bit about the history and the evolution of special operations forces. Long history dating all the way back to the Revolutionary War and through the World Wars, but that history for special operations forces has always been a boom and bust cycle where, hey, they do great things, and then in interwar periods, they find themselves less well-resourced, atrophying, withering, because in the modern era, they're the responsibility of the services, and the way the budget process works, even if there's resources for special operations forces in the initial budget, when things get reprioritized, it turns out that the Air Force would rather have fighters than SOF airlift, and the Army would rather have more armor than certain kinds of resources. And in that early SOF period, there weren't necessarily the right military operations specialties. The career progressions weren't clear. Often to actually get promoted, special operators had to spend a lot of time in the conventional forces rather than being able to be SOF and have a promotion chain through the SOF community and occasionally take a joint broadening experience or back into the core of the service. And so they became what Susan Marquis has characterized as precarious values. They were valued, but not valued as a central part of the service. And with this boom and bust cycle coming out of Vietnam, there were a number of catalytic catastrophes, the biggest one being the Operation Rice Bowl catastrophe at Desert One, where SOF airlift on the way to the hostage rescue in the Iranian embassy, SOF airlift collided with a refueling aircraft, and they lost a lot of personnel, and they had so few aircraft that they couldn't continue the mission. And Congress made big noise about that, and said, hey, let's get this fixed, but that didn't really happen. And then I think I have the dates wrong, but Urgent Fury in Grenada, commander misused SOF as light infantry, and that again exposed this problem. And so finally Congress stepped in '86 with the Nunn-Cohen Amendment and with some follow-on legislation, because again initially there was resistance, and so there was acrimony between the Department of Defense and Congress, but they pushed through and got SOF to what we have now, a 4-star command, United States Special Operations Command, an ASD, an assistant secretary dedicated to special operations and low intensity conflict, dedicated to supporting SOF, and their own major funding program, MFP-11, for SOF peculiar equipment. So USSOCOM can leverage funds from MFP-2, which is for general purpose equipment, where they have equipment in common with the services and the rest of the force, but they also have an independent, dedicated funding stream for SOF peculiar equipment. Next slide, please. So how's that compare to information forces? Well, to me, and maybe to you, information forces feel a lot like earlier era SOF. It's not a coherent force. It's dribs and drabs, it's bits and bobs all over the different services without having a unified identity or unified training. There's disaggregated career fields. Okay, there's a In the Army, there's a branch for psychological operations forces, soldiers who do MISO, but you can't immediately get into that straight out of the academy. You have to lateral move. There are unclear career trajectories, and there's a dearth of senior officers from the community, again, because of the career prospects. If you spend too long in information, you don't necessarily check all the boxes. There's no single institutional home, nor, as Mike's earlier slide showed, do they have a single unified policy champion or advocate. And so there's a lack of resources. When staffing decisions are made, even if billets are assigned, sometimes they sit empty. And much like early SOF, information forces are a precarious value. They're valued, but not necessarily as the top priority. So when the racking and stacking happens, sometimes the attention that they deserve, they don't get. Now, there are some differences, maybe more, but one is a lack of shared identity. Back in the early days of SOF, at least all special operations forces shared a common identity. They are all commandos. They are all silent death with a knife in the night. So they have this unified cultural thing that when you put them all together, there may be some belt measuring, but they get each other. That's not necessarily the case in the information community. You get together an electronic warfare person and an information operations integrator and a psychological operations soldier, and you put them in a room, and they might initially focus more on their differences than on what they have in common. But that could be changed. But anyway, they should have more of a common identity than they do. And perhaps mercifully, although also perhaps arguably, there have been a lack of catalytic failures. We haven't had a Desert One for the information operations community. So following the path of the evolution of SOF could be one way for the department to get better at this. And it would be nice if we could make that transition without having any of these catalytic catastrophes or having the congressional acrimony. It would be nice if the department would ask Congress and say, hey, here's what we think the right answer is, please do this. And Congress could enact it, and then DoD could move out on it without Congress having to come back with repeated thou shalts and compulsory stuff. Next slide. So what do we actually want, or what are we suggesting if you were to apply this SOF model to information forces? So first, under this model, information forces would benefit from some kind of clear, unified organizational home. And that could be envisioned in a lot of different ways. Like United States SOCOM, it could be some wholly new 4-star or 3-star command. It could be an existing command rebranded and remissioned. For example, recent efforts in the Army to make Army Cyber Command, Army Information Warfare Command, even though they've backed off the labeling on that, there's an effort to try to consolidate some of the information-related capabilities in the Army under that command. I think for this to succeed, it would need to be more than that, but if at the service level, so arguably the Marine efforts, standing up a Deputy Commandant for Information and making MEF information groups is a step in this direction as well. And the Air Force is doing stuff too. So there's movement in this direction, but that could be reinforced and maybe could be reinforced at a joint level. This could help with centralizing career progression, maybe having immediate ascension into information as some kind of occupational specialty or branch or career field, with initial training in understanding information and the information environment in general and understanding all of the capabilities, and then specializing in a specific stovepiped capability or less stovepiped capability. Whereas now it's the opposite. You can't get in there initially. When you do finally get in, you start as a specialist, and it's not until you're relatively senior do you start to see the whole elephant and become more of a generalist. Second, the SOF model offers a high-level advocate like ASD Solic. We need something like that, or under this model, you would need something like that for information forces. Now, maybe the PIOA, the Principal Information Operations Advisor, could be something like that. I think as originally envisioned, it could be like that. The difference is ASD Solic's main job is SOLIC, Special Operations and Low Intensity Conference. Currently, the PIOA designate is the Undersecretary for Policy. That's great, it's very senior, but the Undersecretary for Policy is still the Undersecretary for Policy. Their main portfolio is policy. Where is the full-time senior advocate for information? I don't think there is one. We'll see how things actually shake out, but I don't think there is one. There should be one under this model. And then finally, funding. To make this all go, there has to be some kind of fenced, protected resource stream, protected from reprioritization by the services. So maybe an MFP 12? I don't know. Next slide. And with that, that's our patter. We are ready to take questions.
All right, thank you both. So we are going to move on to the Q&A portion of the team session. So feel free to keep submitting your questions through the live event Q&A chat. All right, so our most liked question at the moment comes from Keith. And this question is, with respect to the intel and information community's use of information and resulting conflicts, do you think that these communities think about information differently and use it in different contexts? I think that many communities have different definitions or interpretations of what information is, which results in conflicts between communities. Any comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's often when I talk, there's a bunch of talks that I have a lexicon slide. And one of my first slides has the bullet, information as an English language term is a really broad tent. And I think this is one of the challenges when trying to figure out the right way to talk about these things is what's the right word. And we're hamstrung immediately anytime we say information because the English language denotation of information is incredibly broad. So back when, I guess 2017, when we decided to make information the 7th joint function, I was both thrilled and horrified. Thrilled because having spent most of my career working in this information environment space, seeing it finally be prioritized and emphasized as something worthy of being a joint function, great. Horrified because of this broad tent issue. Without extra words, without extra qualifiers, just information implies this incredibly broad tent. And in fact, if you look at it, you read between the lines like, okay, yes, information is the stock and trade of the intelligence community. Well, information and in the information environment and effects in and through the information environment is the operations in the information environment, the information related capability community. But gee, also information supports decision making, not just as intelligence, but as surveillance and reconnaissance, and passing information around the command, like knowledge management. And in fact, if you read the introduction of information as a joint function, it talks about knowledge management, which is really important, but isn't what we are talking about when we're talking about operations in the information environment. So there's this risk of talking past each other when you talk about I'll give you another example, talking past each other in the intelligence community. Assessment. In the information operations in the information environment community, when we say assessment, we're talking about MOP, MOE, figuring out whether the things we are doing to generate effects are having those effects and why or why not. In the intelligence community, when they say I assess, that's the word, that word assess, assessment, what they really mean is I estimate. That's my guess about what's going on in the world. So if you have an assessment meeting between information professionals and intelligence professionals, you're going to be talking about different things until you get the ground rules straightened out. So there's some natural propensity for friction between the intelligence professionals who deal with information but don't have an identity as information professionals because they don't seek to generate effects in and through the information environment. They just use information to inform analysis, and the information professionals who do that thing. Over.
All right, thank you, Dr. Paul. This next question comes from Todd Beasy, the Director of SMA. And this question is, it seems like the IE tradecraft is very unique and requires not only analytical methodology and tool development, but also a very high level of education to effectively conduct an IE JPO to inform the commander and his planners as they develop IO operations, activities, and investments. Would you agree with this? And what must be done to close this gap? Should this be a sub-career field or a specialty inside the IC?
Sure, I'll jump in there. I definitely have some thoughts on that. So, I mean, in talking with a number of senior DIA officials, they mentioned that they have created institutions, they've created organizations that did specifically this type of analytic work before, right? And so I can think of several in Iraq, I can think of several in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And when these professionals, and because it is right, you need almost a PhD level to understand the culture and the nuance, and not even talking about the language differences, right? You need somebody who has a wide and a deep understanding of the culture that you are looking at. And when we've done that, we put them together. That they'll last for a little while, but then the IC antibodies, a term that a senior DIA official used, will come along, and then that organization will be under-resourced. They won't get the analytic capability. They won't get the staffing that they need, and then slowly over time, it will kind of dissolve. Without making this putting it as stating as a complex problem within the DIAP, and identifying a senior program manager to manage this complicated space, it will continue to be kind of under-prioritized and under-resourced.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schwille. This next question comes from G.K. Allen Jr. from the Joint Staff, and he asks, did you question any commanders about what intelligence they require for operations in the intelligence environment when conducting your study?
So we talked to a couple of J2s at the combatant commands. We talked to a number of senior DIA officials, both currently serving and retired. And we talked, those conversations almost always revolved around prioritization. And look, when you have 20 things on your plate and you have somebody from the IO community that's asking you a super broad and a super ill-defined question, I'm not going to, oftentimes the response was, I'm not going to pull off my analysts that are answering the top 3 commanders' priorities to answer a question on, can you tell me about Poland? Or can you tell me about what Russia thinks about Poland? Something that's super ill-defined and super broad. If we can help the information operations community craft very specific requests for information, that is one of the ways that would help out getting additional support from the analytic community.
All right, thank you. All right, so this next question comes from Kirk Otterson from Los Alamos National Lab, and he asks, the current DoD multi-domain definition, 5 domains, air, land, sea, space, and cyber, doesn't clearly acknowledge the human domain, or social, moral, cognitive. Do you think that this contributes to some of the challenges that you have described in your brief?
Yes and no. So the current domain, being a domain gets you resources. All of the domains have services, or at least combatant commands and really high-level advocacy. Now, is human domain the right domain? I'm not sure. But I've come around from initially not being a huge fan of the human domain to now being more tolerant of it if that were to actually happen and get this the attention it deserves. And if I were the king of the logical hierarchy of doctrine and terminology and how we divide up the universe, cyber wouldn't be a domain and information would be, but that train has already left the station. So if the way forward to get information emphasized is to make it a human domain, okay. The challenge, of course, is the overlap between what I want to see focused on as the information environment doesn't perfectly overlap what is clearly implied in the human domain. And I'm thinking specifically about the related technology, the systems. I'm a classicist. I like the information environment as physical, being wires, routers, computers, boxes, antennae, informational, the actual content, bits, bytes, words, and cognitive plus emotion, the human part, the wetware, what behavioral intentions and perceptions are created by that. When you talk human domain, you risk leaving out the those physical and informational components. Now, you could define it such that you get the informational, but the other thing that you risk is AI is going to play a bigger and bigger role in decision making going forward. AI is definitely not human, but depending on how you define cognitive, AI is a form of cognition. So, but again, now we're in the weeds on the lexicon. So if the bigger point is, does a human domain get us moving in the right direction towards getting resources to and focus on the things that we think are important in this space? Yes. Over.
All right, thank you, Dr. Paul. We also have a question from Kevin, and this question is: certainly OIE folks must consume intel to create effective plans for managing fires, yet the same intel mechanisms might be resistant to collect PED for results or BDA. How can intel collectors explain the importance of things like tying REX or RFI to high NIPF or PIR priority? Otherwise, the collection against OIE feels like collection against yourself or getting trapped in the self-licking ice cream cone cycle.
I'll jump in, Chris, and then I'm sure you have. I know you have some thoughts on that as well. So, I mean, training and education is the answer, right? I mean, what do? You send intelligence analysts to. Some of them get. You can go to a targeting school and deeply understand targeting methodology. Well, how many information operations professionals are attending these targeting schools, and how much training on MIDB and in the different databases that the intelligence community uses when they are going through the targeting spin-ups, the targeting cycle? Well, the answer is probably not a whole lot. And so what you need to do is you need to think about the targeting process writ large. Independent of the work that we've done here, we're out some additional work talking about the joint targeting cycle and how that's tied very closely to the air tasking cycle, and how maybe you need an additional cycle that looks at longer term cognitive effects and that are looking more at behavior change. But because behavior change can happen instantaneously, but it can also happen over a much longer period of time. Whereas when you drop a bomb, the effects are pretty quick and pretty apparent to see.
Yeah, so just to finish the thought, as we've been saying throughout the whole talk, this is a two-sided problem. The information professionals need to better understand how the intelligence process works, how prioritization works, what kinds of things are already being collected and analyzed. So what's actually available, what things aren't being analyzed but are being collected, so would be a relatively easy lift. And the intelligence folks need to understand what kinds of stuff information professionals need to know to do their job, so they can offer stuff. Hey, you really want this? I don't have that, but I have this. It's pretty close. And there's a need, as we discussed earlier, for information environment support to be in the DIAP, to be something that the IC owns enduringly, not just in these little boutique capabilities that have popped up. And so that there's a place for it to go. And we could talk at length about how First IO Command does a bunch of great intelligence environment related products, but because of their peculiar relationship with the IC, those things don't get indexed. So unless you know to go there, you can't get them. And a normal intelligence trained professional won't know about them at all and will just do their responsible things, look up stuff in all the various different indices and find what they have and not find that stuff. So again, two-sided problem, stuff to be done on both sides of the house. Over.
All right, thank you both. This next question just came in very recently, and this person asks, so is the military even the right place to have information operations at all? I believe it should be in the domain of the State Department, and that there needs to be a complete rethink in how we create joint and interagency messages from the top to the bottom across the US government. Is it not an inherently military function, and has it never been? Comments and feedback, please.
So that, I could talk for half an hour on that. The answer is it's complicated. So on the face of it, wouldn't it be great if, so I 10 years ago, more, I worked on strategic communication, which was the buzzword at the time for whole of government, mostly aligned, not perfectly in lockstep, but kind of synchronized and integrated communication across the government. And in that era, there was a clear recognition that, yeah, for public diplomacy and strategic communications, State Department should have the lead. They should be the ones doing this, leading the narrative for the United States. And at the time, in that era, there were all kinds of effort to take Department of Defense efforts described under lines like military support to public diplomacy and give them to the State Department. But the State Department combination of scale, I have to remind my defense colleagues that the State Department has fewer than 1,000 deployable officer equivalents. It is multiple orders of magnitude smaller as an organization than the Department of Defense is. And because of the Department of Defense dwell, train, deploy cycle, the Department of Defense has a backfill culture. So when you send someone to do something else, there's someone next in line who can fill that seat. State Department doesn't have a backfill culture. So when they send someone to do something, if that person had a day job, that job sits undone until they come back. And for a long time, the State Department's culture has been focused on traditional diplomacy. So way back in, 2005, I want to say, Matt Armstrong, who many of you may know, spent time on the Broadcasting Board of Governors. I think he spoke here in this forum at least once within the last year. He wrote in his blog, "American public diplomacy wears combat boots," because who has the force structure? Oh, Department of Defense does. Who has personnel that you can send into harm's way and work in austere or risky environments? Oh, Department of Defense does. Who has trained influence professionals? Think about that. Think about who has trained influence professionals. Well, the psychological operations and military information support operation community. Does the Department of State have trained influence professionals? They have public diplomacy folks, they have public relations, public affairs folks, but they're trained at public diplomacy and telling the US story, not necessarily influence. So if you're asking, should the balance of capabilities, should the Department of State have the lead and be more robust in this space? Absolutely yes. And even if we shift the balance towards Department of State, we should never completely strip the Department of Defense of these capabilities, because Sun Tzu tells us all warfare is based on deception. Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1 tells us that war is a contest of wills, and one way to contest wills is through physical violence, another is through influence. And this issue of austerity, if Department of State had all the influence capabilities when the military deploys forward and goes into harm's way, they need to have communication and influence and information professionals with them to set the narrative on the ground, to achieve effectiveness through the information environment without having to rely on civilians who may or may not be deployable, who may or may not be able to enter into the environment because of sufficient permissibility. And I've gone on long enough, but as you can see, there are a whole lot of issues. It's not an easy answer. So yes, more for Department of State. No, don't try to strip the Department of Defense completely. Over.
And just 2 cents, our second slide, right, listed out a number of publications that were, many of them mandated by Congress, telling the Department of Defense that they will get better at operations in the information environment, and that they should have information forces and capabilities to do that mission.
All right, thank you both. So we are running up against the hour here. However, speakers have agreed to go a few minutes over to address some additional questions. So we'll go ahead and continue with the Q&A. All right, so this next question is, might the proposal that you're suggesting result in another titanium cylinder of excellence rather than the integration of information into joint operations? And what about a hybrid model with stronger doctrine, a higher level of advocate, or a high level advocate and funding?
Sure. So there are some risks associated with a combined model, and I think the biggest one would be integration between information forces and the rest of the force. But it couldn't be worse than it is now, where these guys and gals aren't well integrated, and they aren't well advocated for, and they don't have clear career progressions, and it's really at the individual commanders who get it and want that, ask for it, and then they get bits and bobs and they pull it together. But so could a hybrid model work? Absolutely. There are lots of different ways to make forward progress in this space. What we've suggested here, looking at the soft model, that is just one way to address these core problems. So anything that addresses this unification issue, helps create an identity for information professionals and gives them career fields and progressions. Anything that gives them high-level advocacy, preferably unified advocacy, though I suppose it could be multiple stovepipes of high-level advocacy, but I think it would be better if it was unified. And anything that gives them protected resources, I'm totally open to discussion on that.
And just two thoughts, if I may, Chris. So, I mean, I think within the services, right? And I think about how combined arms warfare is introduced at the lowest level. Well, at the same time, you're not introducing brand new, second lieutenants or ensigns or junior enlisted soldiers into this is combined arms warfare. Oh yes, and this is information warfare, and this is two sides of the same coin. Which a number of the documents that we referenced at the beginning talk specifically about raising the level of the inherent informational aspects of military power. At the same time, think about whenever, I'm speaking Army here, but I mean, this is applicable to all the services, when they go to the National Training Center, the Joint Readiness Training Center, and you do combined arms warfare, well, you have all of your core capabilities together. Well, when the heck do you do that across the information community? When do you bring the EW and the cyber and the influence professionals together? And when do they have an exercise that's designed specifically, or a validation exercise? Well, that stuff doesn't really exist. And that kind of hinders the creation of a community. As Chris mentioned, talking about, at least at the beginning, all soft forces were silent and deadly with a knife in the woods, right? Well, there is nothing like that exists, and you need to kind of start moving in that direction, I think.
All right, thank you both. So this next question is, the reason that intelligence does not support operations in the information environment is because the commander doesn't believe that she or he is responsible for the information environment, correct? Doesn't he or she feel like he or she is only responsible for the operational environment? The PIRs, after all, are supposedly written by the commander. Any comments on that?
Real quick, Chris, and then it's all you. Yes, I agree with that 100%. And until you start relieving commanders that don't focus on operations in the information environment, that you are not likely to have a change. And commanders are not likely to have priority information requirement number one be related to the information environment. And until there is an institutional shift, that won't take place. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so there are a lot of talks that I give where I spend a couple minutes talking about the fact that the information environment is not Las Vegas, and that what you do in the information environment does not stay in the information environment. Commanders should care about the information environment, because I like the phrase operations in and through the information environment, to remind people, staffs, commanders, everybody, that we only care about the information environment because effects transit the information environment and echo in the spatial domains. If the information environment was just something over there that just kind of happened and never really mattered, it wouldn't really matter. But too many commanders think like that, like, oh, information environment, get my IO guy, you go take care of that. Sprinkle some IO dust on this. It's an afterthought. It's a bolt-on. It's Annex Yankee. It's I have a plan. Make a little IO noise to support my plan. It's got to be better integrated. It's got to be prioritized. And yeah, that is one way to solve this problem. And maybe it's a generational thing. Maybe if what Mike was talking about, if we start introducing cadets at the academies, but the first time we say combined arms to them, information is one of the combined arms. And they come up through an era where They understand the strategic corporal, and they understand the ways in which you can impose your will on the adversary through physical means or through the leveraging of informational power, or the two together. And then when they are themselves commanders and get to set priorities, they're like, oh, of course, I need to understand the information environment and the proclivities and propensities of my adversaries so that I can manipulate them. And of course, I'm going to demand that of my two. And if they go back to the intelligence community and there aren't the right boutique capabilities available, I'm going to raise hell because I want my priorities met. So then the challenge becomes, in the meantime, waiting for that generational change. One, how do we make sure that generational change happens? And two, what do we do in the meantime to try to emphasize this? Some commanders get it. Sometimes it's there in the PIR, but then sometimes they can't meet those PIR because, again, the intelligence community doesn't always have, sometimes they've just finished killing a boutique capability and they're loath to reopen it. So they don't necessarily have the necessary expertise. So sometimes even when the right question get asked, the two has to say, yeah, that's a really good question. I will push it into the community. And then the waiting starts. And I've heard, Mike and I have heard horror stories where sometimes the 3.9 shop will write a really good RFI and they'll send it into the community. And then 3 to 6 weeks later, it will come back around. Someone will ask them that exact same question because it's gone through the community and people have been, oh, it's a good question. Yeah, it's important. We should get an answer to that. Find out who knows how to answer that. And it'll come back around, hey, UIO guys, do you already know this? Like, no, that was our question. We want to know that. Where is that supposed to get answered? So in as much as it's a self-perpetuating challenge, maybe the solution is the same thing. If commanders keep prioritizing it and keep asking for it, everybody wants to make the commander happy. So staffs get better, intelligence community gets more responsive, but we could help them by getting it in the DIAP or whatever they're calling that now, helping make that more of a priority, make it more available so that commanders could realize that, oh yeah, that was my priority and now I can actually get an answer to it. Over.
Okay, thank you both. Someone is commenting in the Q&A on Mr. Schwille's statement that Intel generally doesn't like or concentrate on the cultural, sociological, or human analysis. They said, thank you for stating that. I come from a CA background. Don't you see the need for an analysis function generated within CA and PSYOPs units to address the human analysis, and those analysis cells coordinate with Intel?
Yeah, well, I think they're doing that. I think with what I can't, the name escapes me. Is it CKI? I think is what it is. I can't remember the acronym escapes me. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to reinvigorate the civil information management process, the SIM process, where you look at the human, the cultural, the linguistic, the behavioral aspects of a population in a given region, and then you record and you have a database that you can reference in the future. Well, they're looking to operationalize that into being able to mine that data, to be able to have it put into a system of record in such a way that it's useful and it's accessible for commanders on the ground. And so I think there are some efforts within the CA community specifically that are underway looking at that.
And if I may, your question highlights one of the challenges that we noticed, but we didn't really hit on today, which is this self-help issue. So I'm an IRC or IO guy. I ask for something. I fill out a RFI. Nothing comes back. Well, I need that information to do my job, so I do it myself. But then someone from the 2 comes by with the JAG and tells me that I haven't used proper oversight and I'm not actually doing analysis and I need to stop doing what I'm doing. So that's the sort of thing that is a challenge, right? Because if we need to know this information, who's going to do it? And there's this, everybody's type A and can do. So if the IC is too busy or doesn't know how, I'm going to do it myself. But then am I at risk of violating intelligence oversight? So maybe there's some need to lay out some clear lanes in the road, like, okay, these kinds of things. And I think there's been some progress there on the PAI stuff. These kinds of things you can go ahead and do yourself with these left and right limits. Don't call it analysis, but call it routine observation of the information environment that you need to do, and do it. And then that's when the cross-functional teams come in. It's like, okay, bring an analyst, bring a professional, someone who knows the rules and the laws, bring the subject matter experts, put them in the same room, let them work together, and the intelligence professional can make an analysis when it needs to be. The IRC guys and gals can make it clear what is actually needed and where it can be had, and you end up with something that gets the mission done, respects all the authorities and equities, and then maybe could get indexed in the IC and made available to others. Over.
Okay, thank you. This next question is, from your research, what Intel functions or products produced from the from collection best support IO products or IO ops? This would help in to focus in prioritization and support to the IO.
Yeah, so I mean, where are the good Intel products? I mean, we can't talk in much specificity here, right? But the things that the first IO command are producing, where again, and Chris already mentioned this, right? They make a good product. You can give them a request. They have some analysts on station that can turn and they can look into whatever your problem is, whatever your problem set is. It takes a little while, and it's going to be hung on their SIPR portal or maybe their JWIX portal. But it's not like Chris mentioned, right? It's not serialized intelligence. There are some creative ways to go about accessing some other sources here, but I would encourage you, if you're really interested about that, to kind of hit me up on the side, and we could set up a more a classified conversation about that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Schwille. So this next question comes from Stephen Downs Martin. And the question is, what is the evidence that implementing your recommendations will improve our warfighting ability?
Yeah, well, it certainly can't hurt. We haven't done any serious comparison of outcome analyses. So especially talking about the information forces and looking at special operations forces, it's based on analogy. Clearly, what was done for the special operations community was of benefit to that community and to the nation. Now, the extent to which the analogy is right for information forces is an open question. There are certainly points of commonality and points of difference. So it's like any kind of case-based historical argument. You're making some assumptions, and it's a story. And if you believe the story, so this story is falsifiable by a better story. So if you or someone else wants to tell a better story where in fact this leads to ruin or to a giant bulletproof stovepipe where the information capabilities never do anything for anyone, but they're all very well funded, and you have good compelling evidence based on the historical record, then that's a valid argument. But it would be hard to build that kind of evidence, and we haven't done more than we have done. Over.
All right, thank you, Dr. Paul. So we have time for one more question. And so I'll use the currently most liked question to wrap things up. So this comes from Peter Chu. And this question is the stovepiping problem that you outline in your report between information operations and the IC basically because US agencies are too large and unwieldy? In a smaller country, for example, Israel, where agencies might be smaller and more integrated, is this less of a problem? And how could the US overcome the issue that he outlines?
Is size a problem? We didn't look specifically about the size of the intelligence community, but we know it's orders of magnitude larger than the information community is. However, we lay out a number of different solutions that in the Intel reports, talking a lot about processes and prioritizing support. And so we give a lot of kind of concrete things that can be done to increase it. I mean, we obviously we thought pretty highly of it and of these solutions. And in talking to, I think we talked to 60 or 70 individuals, both in the Intel community and the IO communities, and this is where we got our kind of our recommendations and our solutions that we bucketed from. So we think we have an analytic leg to stand on, so to speak, here.
And your underlying point about scale is well taken. I've had the opportunity in my career to do work with a number of different smaller, militarily Five Eyes partners, the Kiwis, the Aussies, the Brits. Things are easier from an integration and coordination standpoint because it's a smaller community and folks know each other. And take the UK, for example. It was smaller military, smaller government, but they still pulled a lot of their information capabilities together in 77 Brigade. And they still have this great interagency. So they have military strategic effects, which includes information as a very senior entity with direct liaison with their foreign affairs ministry. So some of the things that they are doing, the centralization and prioritization that they have done, even though it was easier because they were smaller, even though there was probably less need for it because they were smaller, it has served them well. Over.
All right. Well, we've reached the end of today's speaker session with 17 questions remaining. So if you've had a question that wasn't addressed today, feel free to shoot me an email and I can send them over to today's speakers. But in the meantime, thank you everyone for tuning in today, and thank you, Mr. Schwille and Dr. Paul, for taking the time to present today.
Thanks.
Have
Nicole.
a great day, everyone. All right, goodbye.